name is Deneen Woodson, and I'm the Programs Manager here at the Office of Workforce Development. Today, we will be discussing dislocated worker and unlikely to return eligibility. But first, let's do an overview. Remember, there are three programs: adult, dislocated worker, and youth. We will only be reviewing dislocated worker and its eligibility criteria. Let's look at the definition of dislocated worker. It's very basic. It's an adult who has been terminated or laid off of their job through no fault of their own. These individuals are here seeking services because they want to work, but aren't doing so, and it isn't their fault. Before we move on, let's see how much you already know about dislocated worker eligibility. In this scenario, please answer with the letter A, B, or C in the chat. I will read the question and then give you a few seconds to respond. John, who is 27 years old, comes to the One Stop requesting training services. John provides the One Stop staff a document showing that he will be transitioning out of the military in 6 months. Is John eligible for Title I services? If eligible, under what program? A, yes, John is eligible for Title I dislocated worker services. Financial eligibility is not required. B, yes, John is eligible for Title I adult services, but financial eligibility has to be established prior to providing John with training services. Or C, no, John is not eligible for Title I services because he is working full-time. And the answer is A. John is a dislocated worker because he has verified that he will be transitioning out of the military. He will soon be no longer employed. If you answered B, please remember that financial eligibility is not required. If you didn't correctly answer that question, here's another opportunity for you to be successful. This time, complete the poll question and we can discuss the results. Question 1, in order for an individual to be eligible as a dislocated worker, that individual has to meet the basic adult eligibility requirements. Log your results now. A is true, B is false. The correct response is true. Remember, dislocated workers must still meet eligibility requirements just like adults, but there are 7 additional categories. There have recently been some changes to this policy, so we will cover those changes as well. The eligibility requirements for dislocated worker are that they must be 18 years of age or older, authorized to work in the US. And again, that's authorized, not a US citizen, but authorized to work. And if they're male, they must be registered for the selective services. But in addition to dislocated worker requirements, there are 7 additional categories. Remember, dislocated workers must meet basic eligibility requirements just like adults. Let us review these 7 requirements. The first is that the dislocated worker, remember, who is an adult, 18 years of age or older and available to work, must also be in a declining industry or occupation. According to policy, participants must have been terminated or laid off through no fault of their own and have exhausted unemployment benefits. If they didn't qualify for unemployment benefits, they must have demonstrated attachment to the workforce and is unlikely to return to that industry. Number 2 states that they are unable to find employment. This means that they must be terminated or laid off through no fault of their own or have received notice of plant closures within 180 days, but they still must be required to seek employment. This may be someone who needs additional assistance because they've been out of the job market too long and aren't having success finding work. Remember the old days when we used to look for jobs in the newspapers? We know that things have changed, but sometimes people haven't been able to address the changes. The third is self-employment. For self-employment, this isn't just farming. It could be any position where there is a loss of supportive income as a result of an economic condition or natural disasters. For example, with the farmers, if a tornado came through or there was a hurricane or whatever and they lost the farm, the individual needs to find alternative ways to support themselves and their family. Number 4 is displaced homemaker. An example is that an individual, usually a mom, took care of a family for 18 years and now she must return to work. The person must be unemployed or underemployed and had been dependent on the income of another. This can also be the spouse of a member of the armed forces. Number 5 is a separating or transitioning service member. They have already received a notice of separation or medical evaluation board paperwork and is eligible for or has exhausted unemployment benefits for service members. Note that separating service members automatically meet criteria for unlikely to return unless they re-enlist. Number 6 is active duty military spouses. This includes loss of employment due to a spousal relocation, or they are unemployed or underemployed and can't find work. Remember, this does not include those in the Reserve or National Guard unless they're called to active duty. Number 7 is dislocated worker underemployment. And this is a person who is laid off and earns less than 85% of previous employment or uses significantly less skills that are not commensurate with their educational level. This could be an auto mechanic who was laid off from 20 years at a company, but now works as an assistant because he doesn't have the certifications currently needed by the industry to return to that same level of employment. Please note, if an individual is separated for cause and has filed an appeal and is determined to be no fault and eligible for unemployment, he may be classified as a dislocated worker. Remember, WIOA states that dislocated workers are required to be unlikely to return to a previous industry or occupation to justify services. Some categories of unlikely to return are obvious, while others require additional information in order to receive training services. Let's do a review. There are 3 programs: adult, dislocated worker, and youth. In order to be eligible for dislocated worker, the participant must meet one of those 7 categories. In order for a local area to pay for services, a dislocated worker must meet at least one of the 11 following categories, and these criteria may need additional documentation from the participant. Let's review those unlikely to return criteria. They are that the individual worked in a declining industry or occupation, that the individual has been actively seeking but unable to find employment for more than 90 days. The individual was separated from active military duty under conditions other than dishonorable. The individual is a spouse of an active military member and has relocated to accommodate a permanent change in duty station of the spouse. The individual has worked in an industry or occupation for which there are limited job orders. They are insufficiently educated, but does not have the necessary skills for reentry into the former industry or occupation. And that's very similar to the example that I gave you about the auto mechanic. The 7th is that the individual now has physical limitations that will prevent re-entry into their field. They can no longer work up under a car or do long distance truck driving. Number 8 is that the individual has wage loss due to significant variances to normal seasonal employment, meaning that there has been a significant amount of rain that has destroyed the crops, and there needs to be another means of alternative of obtaining employment to support themselves or their families. These last two categories have been recently extended to address concerns with recent questions from our local areas. They are, the individual experiences negative conditions due to economic impact on industries due to national occurrences. This includes recent destructive weather, again, like the hurricanes and tornadoes, which destroy crops and equipment, or a result of the massive layoffs due to the pandemic. Number 10 is that there experiences a change in family situation resulting in financial hardship due to the family situation. It can include divorce, death, disability of the participant, and or the spouse, or any other negative impact on the family situation that would keep a person from being able to return to their work. And then the final is that the individual left employment due to no fault of their own, such as homelessness, due to spousal abuse, or from spousal relocation that required the wife or the husband to keep the family together. Please take note that if individuals are temporarily laid off with a specific return date and are attached to an employer, which would also be known as a leave of absence, they do not meet the criteria for unlikely to return. They can't just be not working and want assistance training for another job. We know that this information can be overwhelming and confusing, especially when an individual is sitting in front of you telling their story. So we are in the process of completing a job aid to make the eligibility determination process a little easier. Stay tuned for more information. Thank you, and that concludes the training on a WIOA, adult and dislocated worker eligibility.